Okay, so now we're going to talk about site prep here, just to finish off this lecture with Vineyard Establishment, just to give you a good understanding of practically how this is all done. Again, if you want to know more about practical farming, I teach two courses in practical farming here at Cornell, aimed at getting you to understand uh, how to actually run vineyards. But this will be kind of a much more broad overview than what we get into in that course. Um, so the first year I call year zero because this is really where we are prepping the land. So we need to clear the land, which is what's happening here, clearing of brush and of trees. Then we'll go through and till up that soil and make it nice and smooth. And then we'll go ahead and put on our amendments, so all of our fertilizers, and then we'll rip it in with a shank, try to get it deep into the soil. Then we'll disc it again and smooth it out. We might put in some irrigation and drainage, which is, of course, we're going to do that after ripping because we don't want to do it before ripping because then we might end up ripping the mains and sub mains for the irrigation, or ripping out the drain tile, which would be a huge bummer, especially because, for instance, irrigation can cost about $3,000 an acre to put out, and drain tiles will actually cost about $5,000 to $6,000 an acre to do. And then this is field cultivation here, which is just smoothing out the land even more after things have kind of been ripped up a little bit through disking. It's still a little bit bumpy. This would smooth it out. Then putting in some cover crops in the fall, which are going to take in the fall and create a nice little ground cover for us through the winter to keep our soil on through the winter when it's raining. We're not losing soil to erosion. And then during the winter is also if we're going to be hand planting, which is generally how we plant grapevines on the East Coast, or on the West Coast rather. We generally do it by hand. We're going to do layout of blocks in the winter so that we can plant in the spring. So, yeah, with site prep, we want to start the year before. And what we're trying to do is get rid of the ground cover that's there, and then try to get rid of most of the roots that are there. So we'll go through, and if we need to rip out trees, we'll use an excavator, and we'll try to take out as much of the root material as we possibly can, because trees can actually carry pathogens, like soil-borne pathogens that can impact vine roots. Specifically, there's one called armillaria, which has been pretty bad in Oregon, but really we're starting now to see it more and more throughout the West Coast. And that's associated with oak trees, oak roots. But armillaria can actually be found on a whole host of different, a whole bunch of different plant hosts, not just oaks, but we most commonly associated with oaks. Right. The other thing we're going to do is get the soil to where we want it. So if there's soil physical problems like hard pans, we're going to rip. Or if there's big boulders, we want to rip those boulders out and move them off the site because pounding in posts is going to be really hard because we need to get posts 3 feet deep. Our end posts go 3 feet deep and our line posts go 2 feet deep. So hopefully getting boulders out of that profile would help that. Incorporating nutrients. Like I said, we generally will do that prior to ripping, and then we'll rip those things in to try to get the nutrients deeper into the soil. Maybe we might put on some compost potentially to increase organic matter content if we have low organic matter soils. We're generally shooting for an organic matter content on a vineyard between 1 to 3%. You're gonna hear some sources say 3 to 5%. That tends to be quite high. 3 to 5% is often what we see in somewhere like Oregon or New York, but it's not necessarily the content that we really want because also Oregon and New York tend to have higher vigor vineyards, which is not necessarily what we are trying to achieve. So generally, globally, we're shooting for an organic matter content range of somewhere between 1 to 3%. Right. We also might need to increase our soil pH through liming, which again we're going to do prior to ripping, and then we're going to prepare a planting grid. So yeah, we might have to go out and log, which is what you see here going on. These are trees, and then it's been ripped out, and that's actually those are burn piles there. Uh, so that this vineyard could go through an expansion. Um, the nice thing about doing this, by the way, is you can use logging companies to achieve this, and you can work a deal out with them where maybe you don't even pay the logging company, but the money that they make is all made off of the trees. But these are kind of deals you got to make for site by site. So what happens is the logging company comes out, they go out and mark the number of trees that they can use for lumber, the rest they can use for pulp. They make an estimate of how much money they're going to make off of it, and then they'll tell you like, yeah, let's just go ahead and we'll take the wood and then get paid just off of those wood sales, or uh, or they'll say like, no, whatever, you need to pay us X amount more because we're only going to be doing pulp and we're not going to make enough money to make this worth our time. But still, a lot of times you can, like oftentimes, doing it this way where you're selling off the wood, it won't necessarily make you money, but it can make you kind of break even on clearing costs, which is nice. So then you can go ahead and rip. This is subsoiling. We'll do it in two directions, at least 3 feet deep. This is what's called a slip plow. And this is going behind probably like a D9 Caterpillar. And this shank here is probably about 3 or 4 feet. But generally go about at least 3 feet deep, sometimes up to about 5 feet deep. And then we'll do it in at least two directions. We'll cross rip. And generally we'll do it like every 7 to 8 feet. And in order to fracture the soil, we want to make sure we're not doing this in wet soil because that'll create concretions that roots can't get through. Like it'll create like a V, concrete V, and the roots will just go down that concrete V and they won't be able to escape. So they're essentially growing in pots. And then, we'll plant cover crops going into the fall, which we will incorporate in the spring. This can protect the soil from erosion, but we can also use cover crops to ameliorate potential issues. So if we're in an area where there are nematodes that vector like family, for instance, we used to be able to use not biofumigation, but soil fumigation as a method to remedy that problem, where we use methyl bromide to kill out all biological life, basically in the top 3 feet of soil. That was actually quite effective. It works to get rid of those nematodes because they don't go that far down. But it's, of course, environmentally a bit of an issue because you're injecting a very harmful chemical into the soil and really killing everything in that soil. So now in most developed nations around the world, you can't do that. So you have to rely on other methods like biofumigation. So using things like mustard mixes or brassica mixes, because brassicas can put out a sort of like a biopesticide kind of through their roots into the soil and kill out organisms in the soil. It may or may not work. It's something that people do because it's one of the only options we have now for fumigating soils. So oftentimes, though, when you see people using mustards as cover crops, that's the reason they're doing it. I mean, that's basically always the reason they're using mustards because mustards are very expensive. Those brassica mixes are really expensive seed mixes. So you generally only see it done on limited areas, and that's why. Most commonly, you'll see people using leguminous cover crop mixes, so things with clovers and peas and vetches in them. There also will generally be like barley or oats in those as well, and maybe a grass in there. And the reason they're using legumes is because legumes have these bacteria on the roots called rhizobia, and they form a symbiotic relationship with the plant where the rhizobia basically harvests nitrogen from the atmosphere and gives it to the plant, and then the plant is giving the rhizobia carbohydrates. So it's so legumes like peas and clovers have a high nitrogen content, So they can, when you till them back into the soil, then you'll have potentially like a high mineralizable nitrogen content in your soil. So you're, adding to the nitrogen. It's a little bit more complex than what I just said. And if you want to talk more about nitrogen cycling, we can do that. I spent my master's degree looking at nitrogen in soil and looking at using cover crops to potentially supply nitrogen to grapevines. So then comes year one. So now we have laid it out, and we're going to put the vines in the ground in the springtime and grow them out. So typically we plant dormant grapevines in the spring. That's kind of what we're shooting for. We generally do it by hand planting on the West Coast, and it costs us roughly $1,200 to $1,600 an acre, right? And we usually use what's called a transit to mark out grids. Again, if you want to learn how to do this kind of stuff, we do it in my practical farming course, and I actually show you all how to use a transit and mark out a vineyard. But yeah, the cost is roughly the same between machine and hand. I would say quality control is a little bit better with hand, but machine you can do with less folks, which is generally why people have done it here on the East Coast. So with hand, you can plant a perfect grid. So it's very straight going down in a crossroads, and then at a 45-degree angle as well, it's straight. So you have a nice perfect grid. It looks good. With machines, you can't really get it to be a perfect grid exactly. It's close, but not exactly dead on perfect. With hand, I think you get a generally potentially better attention to detail because your folks can do QC. They're looking at every single vine before it goes in the ground, and then ditching vines that don't look right, hopefully, and then they're also putting it in the holes and then pulling up. They put the vine in the hole, then they put the soil over the roots, and then they pull up a little bit so that the graft union is about 6 inches above the soil surface. And then also by pulling up, you're allowing the roots to be oriented so they're going downwards rather than growing out horizontally, which also gives you less potential for J rooting for that reason, and also scion rooting because you're making sure that your graft union is above the soil surface. I've seen the machines plant vines quite low into the ground, which gives you a potential for scion rooting. And once that scion roots, then you essentially have an own-rooted grapevine. With hand, you're not limited by slope or field condition either. So we can go out and do this on real steep slopes where maybe doing it with a machine on a 20% slope is not the best idea for safety, or doing it in kind of wetter conditions. That being said, I wouldn't even hand plant in wet conditions because when you are digging or doing any kind of if you're using augers in wet conditions, you can create concretions wherever you make your holes, and then you basically are planting your grapevine into a pot, and then you'll end up with J rooting. The cons, of course, of hand planting, you need a lot of labor, which on the East Coast, you don't have a large labor source here. On the West Coast, we have a larger pool of folks to pull from. It's going to be slightly more expensive, not that much more expensive, but it does require specialized skill to do layout because you need to know how to use a transit. At the very least, use a manual transit, but then if you're doing really large layouts, then you might need to know how to use a total station, which is a specialized survey tool. So we'll put those vines in the ground, and then we will put, there's stakes next to them, which they're going to grow up. And then we're going to put these vine guards around them. In this case, these are milk cartons. These are quite cheap. They're about 10 cents each. We can get bigger ones from the nurseries, which are about 25 cents each. Or we can buy plastic tubes, which we can reuse. And those cost roughly 75 cents to $1 each. But what these are used for is really just so we can spray herbicides, because then what we're going to do is go and spray about a meter strip about 3 to 4 feet under the vine, so that we keep the vine, this area, clear of anything that can compete with these roots, so that these vines are getting as much water and nutrients as they need to grow up. So in the first few years, our goals really are to establish permanent vine structures, so establish roots and cordons, roots, trunks, and cordons, and yeah, establishing our healthy roots. And then hopefully we're trying to attain a crop by year 3. Generally, we're not trying to get a crop on year 2. Sometimes we can get a small crop on year 2, but actually a lot of times the amount of fruit that we're getting in year 2 is just not even really economical to put a crew out and pick. So generally, though, we're shooting for that first crop by year 3. So in first 1, we're really just trying to allow that grapevine to grow up and establish carbohydrates that I can use for year 2. A lot of times in year 1, we just let it grow. And we don't do anything. We don't even try to establish trunks in year 1. We just let it go. And we may not even need to put trellis in year 1 because of that. We're just going to kind of let it go. And so coming into the winter, this is actually year 1. That's a typo in the slide. This is the winter of year 1. We might go ahead. So now we let the vines grow out. Then we might go ahead and put in the trellis. We probably will at this point, and at least just the fruiting wire. And because in year 2 we're going to start establishing trunks. So this is kind of how vines will look. I'm going to skip. I skipped over that slide for a reason, because really what's going to happen is we're only going to get to, we might have some trunks that we established. Again, this is year 1. We may just go to here and establish a trunk. We probably won't be up at the wire, like on the wire yet. But also, like, a lot of our vines are just going to go back to being 2-budded spurs down here in the winter of year 1. And then really in year 2, we're going to be trying to establish our trunks. So year 2 in the spring, now we're trying to establish trunks. So now we'll go out and we'll thin down to probably 2 shoots per vine. So, you know, we might push out like 4-5 shoots in these vines, but we're going to, mid-season, we're going to go out and choose 2 of them and leave them. And the reason we would do 2 and not 1 is just an insurance policy. In the winter, we're probably just going to choose 1 as a trunk if we're on the West Coast and we're just doing single trunks. So now this is the winter of year 2 and going into year 3. Now we're going to have trunks, or we're going to go unilateral here and lay down on the wire if it's thick enough. So we generally say pencil thickness. If it's pencil or a little bit beyond a pencil, then that is a good candidate for a trunk, and we'll lay it down on the wire. And then we may go 2 directions potentially. And if we're going to do like multiple trunks, and we have these 2 shoots, like if we're here on the East Coast, then we can go both directions. So that first cropping year is year 3, and generally we're going to get a fraction of a full crop load. So it's going to be about 12 to 50% of full cropping yields. And then also we still are going to have vines of varying degrees. Like we're still going to have some vines that have been 2-budded because they didn't do so well going into year 3. Some are going to be unilateral, some are going to be bilateral, whatever. Some are just going to be trunks. So that's accounting for some of this as well, why we have these lower yields. Also, simply, we just don't have a lot of carbohydrate storage yet in these vines. So by year 4, we're near full cropping, and usually by year 5, that's when we should be at full crop loads. All right. So there's kind of a summary of everything like that we've talked about in this lecture. And then in class, I think we're going to talk about operations for a bit, and then we're going to start actually doing site selection and planning for your sites.